Hello and welcome. I'm Mark Winkworth. You're listening to Tales of the Sea. Today I want to talk about food and the choices we make about what we put into our bodies. You know, nowadays it seems like every food choice we make is loaded with questions. Is the food sustainable? Where did it come from? What did it cost our planet to get onto our plates? And the list goes on. But what if I told you there was one food, small, briny, and older than civilization itself, where the more you eat, the better off the oceans become? If you guessed oysters, you are correct. Oysters filter the water around them. 50 gallons of water per day per oyster, in fact. Oyster farms create habitat. And the oyster industry, particularly here in Maine, is quietly doing something else remarkable. It's opening up a life on the water to people who never dreamed it was possible for them. My guest today has spent over a decade researching oysters, the people, the places, and the stories behind them. She's a food writer, a certified oyster sommelier, the founder of Lady Oyster Tours Tastings, Maine's first oyster culinary tour company, and the author of a brand new book, Oyster Society, Adventures with the Shellfishly Motivated. I'm pleased to welcome to Tales of the Sea, Virginia Shaffer. Virginia, welcome to the program. And I want to start by saying that your book, Oyster Society, Adventures with the Shellfishly Motivated, is a terrific, terrific read. It's entertaining, insightful, completely engaging. The book's a real page-turner for anyone who wants to know anything and everything about oysters.
Thank you, Mark. That means so much to me. I appreciate all of the feedback. It took 5 years to write, so there was a lot of just evolution in this book, and certainly within myself as I went through it.
So let's start with your growing up, east shore of Maryland, as I remember, a place known for striped bass, bluefish, flounder, and some of the best shellfish in America, blue crabs, clams, and oysters. And it was oysters that really caught your imagination. When it comes to the ocean, do you have a first memory of the sea?
My grandmother, Nancy Shaffer, she was an artist. We kind of lived inland on the eastern shore, but I remember early moments of going over to my grandparents' house, sitting with my grandmother outside. She overlooked an area called Oyster Cove, believe it or not.
Oh, how prophetic.
And she was an incredible oil paints artist. And we would just sit together and she would tell me all about the saltwater marsh. And I think about that all the time, that I just was so lucky to have someone teach me the value of that at such a young age.
And I believe that saltwater marshes in Maryland are great homes to blue crabs and oysters. Do you remember the first time you had an oyster? You tasted an oyster?
I do. And this is with my other set of grandparents. It's so funny how seafood was sort of ingrained on both sides of the family when we were together. But my grandfather brought this ball jar to the house full of pre-shucked oysters. I was about 6 years old. I forked one out of the jar, put it on a saltine, put cocktail sauce, lemon, horseradish, extra salt on top of this, and made a sandwich, and then ate that oyster. So that is my first memory, reminds me of my roots all the time.
Yeah, I'll bet. Perfect oyster sandwich. Everything that I would say to people now, like, don't do. Everything I'd be saying, like, just taste the oyster first. And oysters from different waters are going to taste differently, which makes sense. So there's the term terroir that refers to the soil where grapes are grown and how it affects the taste of the wine. But with oysters, the term is merroir. Can you explain that term?
Merroir is what we're using today to describe a sense of place for an oyster. We're so lucky that oyster farms have allowed us really to define flavor and sense of place by location. It's not like a fish traveling upstream in the sea and kind of stretching through multiple locations. So merroir is all about specificity of place. It's what we taste, and it's how that animal is grown through nature, labor, and time.
Your journey, Virginia, to becoming an oyster sommelier, and that's a term that's only 3 or 4 years old, about the time the Oyster Master Guild started its certification program, which coincidentally was about the time you decided to explore your passion for all things oyster related. And at the time, you were holding down a very demanding corporate job and had also started a blog about oysters. At what point did you realize that it was time to choose between that security of the job and that personal passion?
I had started the oyster blog because I realized very quickly after a few years of being in corporate sales that I didn't really have any hobbies. I was always tethered to a phone. I forgot that I lived less than a mile from a beach and a shoreline myself. And so there was already this feeling like I needed to reconnect a little bit with nature. And so when I started the blog, it was very simple. It was just a way for me to do a personal study. But about 5 years into that, I was really going through a crisis of just identity, feeling like I was two parts of one whole, and meeting so many incredible people in oysters that I just didn't get to meet in my daily job. I felt like I just felt different. And it all kind of came to a head after I had been in the corporate space in my current job for about 10 years. I had debated going for a promotion to a VP role, talked it through through therapy as well, and decided to go for it. And I didn't get the job.
You didn't get the vice president gig.
And I just felt like in that moment, the universe was telling me, you know what, you've invested so much time, so many years, so much of your love and energy into this other place. Maybe that's right for you now. That's kind of where that happened.
It sounds like one of those wonderful aha moments. The path ahead is suddenly crystal clear. And on a personal note, I'll add lucky for those of us who live here in Maine. A side note to our listeners, my wife and I spent a beautiful late afternoon recently on the water in the town of Phippsburg, Maine, tasting oysters that had been handpicked by Virginia from various farms around the state of Maine, followed by a succulent lobster roll before heading out in a small boat to the Meadows River, where we visited an oyster farm and, yes, tasted more oysters. And that's why I say it's lucky that we have Virginia here in the state of Maine and her new business called the Lady Oyster Tours and Tasting. Let's go back, Virginia, to your first visit to an oyster farm. And this is a farm in Wellfleet, Massachusetts. What is it about that visit that spoke to you, saying, in effect, this is something I need in my life? This is something that's in my bones.
I just had this inkling, like I needed to get out of the house. I needed to see something interesting. And I had no shame cold calling an oyster farmer because I cold called in my daily life. It was just, I didn't have a problem with that. And when he said I could come visit, I was like, wow, first call, first oyster farm, I'm getting a yes, come on down and see the farm. When I was out there, I didn't really realize how much things shut down on an oyster farm in wintertime in New England. My husband, Warwick, God bless him, was like, we'll freeze our tits off. And we threw in that humor pretty early on in the book. But when I was out there and we were shucking oysters and I was just in rain boots in the middle of the water, freezing my toes off, I felt alive in a way that I hadn't felt in a really long time. I felt like I was touching something. I was tasting something. I was feeling cold. And there's something about cold weather and oysters that is kind of a lovely match. So all of that sparked a very quick love and obsession right away.
Before we get too deep, I thought we could review some technical terms because they'll come up naturally in conversation. And I would love folks listening in not to be confused or wonder, what the heck is that? So let's go through a few terms that refer to oysters specifically. The first one is that oysters are bivalves.
So we're looking at, mussels, clams, scallops, oysters, all animals that have two shells that are held together by one ligament.
Okay, there's diploids and triploids. This one I find fascinating.
Yeah, diploids are a naturally spawning oyster. But what we've found in a lot of oyster farms today is farmers are opting to have a combination of diploids and what's called a triploid. And a triploid is selective breeding for oysters that do not spawn. And this allows the oyster to focus on really just eating all year round and that meatiness that you'll find in an oyster.
Okay, to recap then, oysters are called bivalves because they grow in a two-sided shell held together by one ligament. Diploids are oysters that do, in fact, spawn. Triploids are sterile oysters that do not spawn, but rather use all their energy for growing rather than any energy towards reproduction. Moving on then. Oysters go through, I believe, 4 stages of growth, and so what are those?
We have, let's see, the egg or embryo, the larva, and then you have a spat, and then you have an adult oyster.
I think folks get the embryo and the larvae stage. By the way, that's the only time these kids are going to be swimming freely.
This is true. I joke that it's like the rumspringa of oysters. They get their 2 weeks to just, float freely and do as they please with a tiny little foot that they end up losing once they land somewhere.
Right. So you're comparing these baby oysters to the rite of passage in some Amish communities, the time when teens can go out into the world free of the strict society rules to decide if they want to fully commit to Amish life. So these tiny embryos, they float freely for a short period of time until they find a place to call home. And that's what the spat is, which is a term that is really interesting. So the spat is actually a tiny little critter that's found its home.
Yeah, that's exactly that moment when that small microorganism of an oyster lands on another piece of shell or substrate and starts growing its own shell.
Then there's the term seed, which refers to what?
Seed is a sort of a more general term for oyster farmers. So just like agricultural farmers who purchase an amount of quote-unquote seed every year for their product, oyster farmers do the same. So seed comes in sizes of oysters as small as about 2 to 3 millimeters, up to really any size an oyster farmer wants to start growing that animal.
So a little bag could carry thousands and thousands of these little seeds, correct?
Yeah, when an oyster farmer gets their order for the year from a hatchery, which is a seaside lab that is growing these animals, I call it essentially like one big oyster hot tub.
Oh, now there's an image.
A little box with a bag of oysters will arrive to the farm. And I mean, a bag about, the size of your fist, maybe a little larger, is about 30,000 oysters.
Wow, 30,000.
So it's a very important day at the farm. Everything stops to get these babies in the water and in the right location where they're going to grow for a certain amount of time when they're super young.
And when they arrive, are they already attached to a little piece of substrate?
Yes, they have. So that all happens in the hatchery. So what the technicians do is once those oysters spawn and they're free floating in these big trays and tubs, they will dump in what's called culch. It is a bunch of small broken up shell, very tiny fragments for every oyster to eventually land on in the tray. And that is what creates a singular animal really versus what we see in the wild, which are these clustery oyster beds and reef systems where they're essentially landing on each other to create one larger reef. So that's what makes our animals now a really singular animal that we see on the half shell today.
Right. Okay, so next term is adductor muscle, is that correct?
Yes, not to be confused with abductor. The adductor muscle, and I love this sort of analogy. It's like, that really awkward machine in the gym where you're taking your legs and you're pushing them closed and open.
Yeah. It's the hip adductor machine, appropriately named. Now, what is the adductor muscle on an oyster?
So an adductor muscle is this tiny little circular muscle that's embedded inside the meat of the oyster. You'll find it on the half shell. That is stuck to the top shell and to the bottom shell. And that muscle is what is flexed when an oyster is closing itself and opening.
Right, to eat. That's how they get water in, by opening and closing, and the water contains nutrients that are the growing oyster's food. Phytoplankton, algae, organic material, for example. Okay, the term cup refers to what exactly?
Cup refers to the side of the oyster that is the natural spoon, as I refer to it. So you'll have one flat side on an oyster and one cup side on an oyster, and that's the scoop, essentially.
Okay. So where's the hinge of an oyster? Where's that located?
The hinge is that back V corner of the where the two shells meet and are joined together by a ligament. The opposite side of the bill, essentially, which is what's opening.
Right. And when you shuck an oyster, that's the area that you look for, correct? That little area where you can break that connection?
Definitely. There are different techniques to shucking. Some, like in the Chesapeake, there's a knife that's super long called the Chesapeake stabber, where some shuckers prefer to go in by the side or the bill. But most shucking today is, especially for our East Coast oysters, is through the hinge, which is that tiny little V that you can wedge your knife into and wiggle.
One of my first jobs, I think it was 15 or 16, was to shuck oysters at a seafood restaurant on Long Island. I was a lousy shucker back then. I got sent to wash dishes right away. In my defense, no one ever taught me. Shucking is a real art. Okay, so the mantle on an oyster refers to what?
The mantle is the outer edge of the oyster's gills, essentially that sort of contour around the oyster meat itself. And the mantle is what secretes nacre, or calcium carbonate, that is a liquid that then turns into a solid, creating the shell.
So the nacre builds up layer by layer. They become the pearly colored shell that the oyster's attached to, both the top and the bottom. You know, Virginia, I'm learning a lot about taste, and that has everything to do with where the oyster happens to be located. If there's a freshwater source on one side and saltwater on the other, like I'm thinking of the Damascotta River and wonderful flavor variation, taste between oysters way up near town and the oysters way down near the ocean. It's really the merroir, as you say, and in this case, the subtle difference is in the brininess. Is that accurate?
Brininess refers to salt. The more scientific world, they refer to it as parts per thousand. So a really briny oyster might be up in the 30s. A less briny oyster might be sitting in that sort of 13 to 15 parts per thousand.
And a related term, I believe, is liquor.
Liquor is also an industry term for the brine.
And I remember that brine is an important part of the oyster tasting experience, correct?
Yeah, taste appreciation. We're asking them to taste the brine first before they eat the oyster.
And that's part of what makes for different finishes in the mouth and the aftertaste, correct?
Finish and aftertaste are roughly the same thing, and it's kind of what we talk about in wine. It's a flavor or taste or texture that lingers on the palate. An oyster might have a really clean or short finish, but it also might have something that lingers on the palate, maybe some minerality, maybe some algal notes or something that's just kind of sitting with you for a little bit longer. Those oysters with a longer finish are best paired with something really acidic.
Like a nice bone-dry muscadet. Okay. The term fluting refers to what?
Fluting is really a shell shape. It is how currents and movement manipulate how that oyster is changing in shape as it grows. A fluted oyster might be one that has kind of frilly edges, wavy edges, and a lot of that has to do with how they're grown. If they're beach tumbled, we see a lot more fluting. There is some new study out there around whether that fluting is actually created by the oyster to slow down currents so they have more access to food as that water is washing over them. So it's really interesting to discuss and to observe different shell makeup.
I never thought about how an oyster might move around and to manipulate that shell shape in different ways and help them get the food that they really need. I read that oysters don't have brains, but rather nerve centers called ganglia. So to think that they might have some control over their tumbling is really very interesting. Can you explain a little bit about tumbling for us?
We talk about this all the time. We can actually manipulate this animal a little bit on the farm to achieve that beautiful teardrop, deep-cupped shape that everyone loves to see at the raw bar.
And what do these tumblers look like?
It sort of looks like a cylinder with a bunch of holes poked in it.
Okay, and what does it actually do to the oysters?
For me, it's like a spinning cheese grater. That's how I kind of describe it. And you throw the oysters in through the tumbler, and they kind of get knocked around like popcorn. And at that point, that oyster is working so hard to keep itself together so that adductor muscle we talked about is getting some exercise. It's also chipping off all of that new feathery growth, a very thin growth on the very edge of the bill of the oyster, and encouraging that oyster to actually grow down into its cup versus long and flat.
And as you mentioned, that deep cup shape is the shape preferred by purveyors as well as consumers. So, Virginia, I'm assuming there's also a form of natural tumbling, yes?
When we also have tumbling in nature or on a beach, that's also kind of keeping that oyster rounding as it's being knocked around by waves.
So, okay, there's one other thing I want you to explain, and that's how and why oysters can change sex. Most of them, it turns out, are actually born male. In fact, the majority, I think, are born male. Then they may go through what's called sequential hermaphroditism, or scientifically, protandric hermaphroditism. Oh man, almost made it.
There's a lot of syllables in that. That is so interesting about our oysters. They can change sex. What is sequential about that is that most oysters are actually born male. At about a year or two, as they get larger in size, a good portion of them will transition to female. And this kind of supports more egg production, more chances of survival for the oysters. But it's called sequential and protandric because once they switch to female, it is highly unlikely that they will switch again back to male.
But they could, right?
You know what? I think that there's still so much study around that, and it varies by species as well. But it's just another part of oysters there that's kind of a mystery. And over millions of years, this animal has figured out how to survive.
Right, and it is one fascinating critter. Okay, without a doubt, oysters are one of the most place-specific foods on the earth. I think it's safe to say their flavor is literally the taste of the water that they grow in. So, what are the factors that affect that taste?
There's an abundance of things. So you are experiencing when you taste an oyster, whatever that current is bringing that oyster, salinity, minerals in the water, what they eat, which is phytoplankton, algae, even detritus, which is sort of like the compost of the sea. And then, of course, any vegetation that's around that oyster that it's filtering and picking up. At the same time, seasonality plays into that too. So an oyster will taste sweeter in the fall as it is storing glycogen in its body to prepare itself for winter.
Right, preparing to hibernate. You know, when you talk about oysters from the Northwest or Georgia, Florida, Louisiana, for you, how has spending so much time visiting farms all over the country through those years changed the way you experience the ocean itself?
Oh, in so many ways. I look at a coastline so differently today than I used to. And it is around really that I can feed myself from this body of water. I'm kind of looking at it as such an abundance of food, and food that I can pluck out of the ocean and open myself. I mean, that is a really primal, wonderful feeling. I'm also taking notice of things in the area more. So if there's shellfish in the Pacific Northwest, I'm looking at the vegetation, the sea lettuce, the elements that are around this oyster that might contribute to the flavor. So everywhere I go, I'm kind of picking up new cues now from nature that might distinguish this oyster from one place or the other.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Oysters are natural water filters, and this really means that oysters essentially act as the marine ecosystem's kidneys, as it were. To the other critters in the sea, this constant purification means three critical things for survival and growth. I mean, there's cleaner water, there's better breeding ground, and safer nurseries. Do the oyster farmers and growers that you've met think about this and embrace their role as stewards of the coastal ecosystem and not just or simply producers of food?
They do, and this is the single most story I hear from most oyster farmers on why they even got into the industry. What I love about oyster aquaculture is that there truly is a noble purpose behind it. People really feel called to not only producing this animal for food, but also what they're able to put back in the water.
Virginia, in your travels over the years, you've met with people behind what's called the oyster renaissance. Can you define what that movement means for listeners?
It's such a wonderful thing to kind of see. And when you put it in the context of history, it's better to understand. The 20th century was sort of riddled with issues around water quality. We kind of talked about how we saw oysters have taken this they took this deep dive in the 20s due to a typhoid outbreak and water quality issues.
Right, that was back in the 20s, the typhoid outbreak in New York City. And a number of other cities at the time. The outbreak in New York City was blamed on raw oysters. It certainly affected people's desire to eat seafood of any kind for some time.
And it wasn't until the Water Quality Act came through and was put into practice in the early 70s, and other things like getting DDT and pesticides out of our waterways, that really kind of jump started us getting seafood back into what we eat now. And the government at that time had issued a ton of grant money to marine biologists to get back out on the water and see how we could make seafood affordable and get more and greater volumes of it back into the diet. So I think the 70s is where it all began.
A quick side note here, Senator Edmund Muskie of Maine was one of the primary drivers of the Clean Water Act back in 1972. The act significantly changed U.S. aquaculture by making unpermitted pollutant discharges illegal, introducing permits for concentrated aquatic animal production facilities, and establishing national wastewater and technology standards for fish farms. As a result, we now have raw oyster bars all through the country. That's not a bad thing at all. So, Virginia, do you find a shared ethic, if you will, among farmers and folks who are involved in this industry about how the ocean should be treated, or does stewardship look differently depending on where you are in the states?
I would say everyone acknowledges it and knows it, and really cares about what these animals are doing for ocean health.
Right, right. Yeah, the health of an oyster harvest is a direct measure of the health of the waters where the oysters are grown. What did you see or learn on your journey that most alarmed you about the state of our coastal waters? If there was something that alarmed you, what was that?
I think what concerned me the most was learning that we had over harvested and decimated over 90% of our wild oyster beds around the country. And as a result, had to turn to aquaculture for consumption in many ways because sustainable harvesting practices didn't exist everywhere.
Virginia, your book, Oyster Society, as a number of reviewers have noted, to me, really picks up where the book, The Big Oyster History on the Half Shell by Mark Kurlansky, essentially leaves off. His stories about New York Harbor and the bountiful oyster beds, the sailors not being able to sleep at night because of the hulls of their boats banging constantly against oyster shell beds. Back in those days, you could walk out into the bay in New York Harbor and pick up oysters, right out of the water. Oysters were cheap and sold on New York City streets from carts, like hot dogs are sold today. That, as you said, oysters got a bad rap due to the typhoid outbreak and because waters got polluted. But in all of your research, what gave you the most hope? And we're talking here about our coastal waters. Were there places where you felt the relationship between people and the sea was not only working, but growing and thriving?
Absolutely. I mean, almost every oyster farm I visited gave me a sense of hope that we are using this practice as a way to support the larger ecosystem. What I found really intriguing, there was a study that came out years ago in Stamford, Connecticut, around what oyster aquaculture and what clams were doing for that local coastline and how much nitrogen removal services, that cost they were saving because they had an industry for shellfish aquaculture. And it was millions of dollars a year in taxpayer money that this industry was supporting as far as natural nitrogen removal. And I found that just so incredible that now we're able to kind of quantify what that could be for a coastal town if we continue to implement these practices. So I've heard hopeful stories around that. The Billion Oyster Project in New York is an incredible program of restaurants and people coming together to invest in the New York harbor and clean it up. So these things, I mean, oysters are such a powerful tool for ocean health, and I feel like we've just barely scratched the surface.
So, if you will allow me, I want to jump across the pond just for a minute and talk about oysters in other parts of the world. France is Europe's largest producer, I think 80% and more. Ireland, Spain, Netherlands, Croatia, UK, Norway, Germany. Have you had a chance to sample Europe's oysters, and how do they begin to compare? I know that's kind of a big question, but how would you look at some of the oysters as compared to what we're growing now in the States?
It's a big question, but what's interesting, at least about the book and how I was writing it, there were a lot of great global stories that I had as well. There were several times where I went to France and tried the oysters there. I have been to China, tried the oysters there, and I will say, if we're in Europe, the native oyster there was the European flat. And we can still find that oyster in many parts of Europe, but it's very difficult to farm. So most of Europe has switched over to the species that we have on the West Coast, which is the Magellana gigas. That's that big, deep cupped oyster that we might find there. And I find some of the flavor profiles to be sometimes similar, melon flavors, cucumber flavors, really good minerality, a little more complex than what we have on our East Coast. The European flat is, I would say, not for everyone. It's also referred to as the Boulogne oyster after giving tribute to the Boulogne River in France. Some people describe that as quite metallic in flavor. So if you're not used to it, that can be almost alarming. But after eating them a few times, you kind of, you really accept that profile, and there can be some really good sweetness in those oysters.
Interesting. Am I remembering or misremembering that there are European flats grown or found in the States?
Yes, yes. And actually, there was an amazing local article that just came out of a newspaper here in Maine talking about some of that history. This all happened in the 1950s, so fairly recently, that some scientists came over from Europe and brought the native flat to see if they could grow it in Maine and establish a market here. Tried to farm the oysters, didn't work out so well as they learned. A lot of the oysters were just kind of scattered down a bunch of different rivers and bays. They came back in full force on their own, and you can find them everywhere. I can walk outside of where we do tastings in Phippsburg and pick them up at low tide.
Wow. Can you harvest them all year long?
So, what we do as far as tasting work and the business we have, you can't really consume them in summertime. September 15th is the date where we're allowed to harvest and serve those oysters. And we have a secret source for those, and we give everyone at least one European flat to try because some will love them and some will hate them.
Well, that's understandable. But in terms of eating them only at certain times of the year, I assume that's because of the water temperature?
Well, it's a couple of things because they're considered wild oysters. They don't really have water quality testing as much as we will see in our aquaculture side of the business. So recreational harvesting is a bit of a concern in summertime. Warmer waters for sure, bacteria, but also what people don't know about the flats is they are brooders. They don't broadcast spawn. The female oysters will keep their eggs inside their shell until they are ready to move on and become spat. It's a really different reproductive process, but that means in summertime when they're spawning, they get kind of gritty and spawny. So they're not very tasty.
Yeah, I'll remember to keep them off the plate. So oysters are also considered a superfood, correct? They're low calorie, nutrient dense, good for your heart and your brain, and of course the myth that it's good for the libido, helping helping to boost energy levels. Also because of the zinc content.
They are one of the best foods anyone can consume. I mean, per calorie, this animal has more protein than most animals we eat. The omega 3s, fatty acids, the vitamin Bs are incredible. In fact, they used to serve oysters way back when in insane asylums because vitamin B was a mood booster and served as an antidepressant. And then you have all of your trace minerals like your copper, selenium, and of course, zinc that just help with circulation and brain function. So almost too many benefits to count. And I tell people if you just eat a few oysters every single week, your health is going to be incredible.
I totally believe that. That's why my wife and I head over to the shop on Washington Avenue or Jay's Oyster, yeah, downtown here in Portland, to slurp up our oyster quota. I just had this image of an asylum at mealtime. Okay, folks, okay, it's time for your oysters. Oh, not again, no. And today we're going to put caviar on top. No, please, no, not with caviar again. Virginia, there are so many passionate, inventive, fascinating, absolutely colorful characters that you write about in your book. Can you single out a couple for us? And I know this is, I don't want to get into spoiler alert, but a couple people who really opened your eyes to the possibility of changing your life completely by following your passion.
A few come to mind, and there are many.
Hmm.
My first encounter with the Malinowskis on Fisher's Island was incredible. Sarah is a true activist for the environment. When I met Imani Black, we both came from the same town but had very different lived experiences. And she opened me up to a Black maritime history that was so lost in the Chesapeake and not really documented. And she was working on that. That really took me into a new area of social understanding about history and marine culture.
Yeah.
And then there are people like Jack Rudlow. He's kind of this nutty curmudgeon 80-something-year-old naturalist who took me through marshland that he had actively saved, tens of thousands of acres he and his wife protected on the Florida Panhandle. A lot of this was around environment, but it was opening up my eyes to how much more I could do or affect if I really wanted to.
Hmm.
Lots of wonderful people in that book that I hope readers will fall in love with and maybe open up their eyes as well.
Absolutely.
There is now a Shellfish Growers Climate Coalition as a part of the Nature Conservancy that's really championing some of our fisheries around the country, both traditional and modern aquaculture. And I think that is really important because both traditional fisheries and modern aquaculture have, in some ways, sat on separate sides of the aisle in the past. There has been a lot of work to bring those back together to start advocating for what they really need to preserve coastal communities. And so that coalition is doing a really great job nationally to do that and to bridge those gaps.
Virginia, you are now a certified oyster sommelier, running Maine's first oyster culinary tour group, the Lady Oyster. Can you tell us about that certification? As I don't think a lot of people are familiar with the term oyster sommelier. I know I wasn't. How did that come about?
Oh, well, I'll start with the guild, the Oyster Master Guild, because I think that is an incredible story. Julie Chu founded this alongside Patrick McMurray, and both of them are incredible seafood educators. They had done a ton of consulting work already with restaurants and helping them up-level their raw bar programs and educate on how to shuck well and all of these pieces that are really important in handling shellfish. Julie, who had been working in marketing for a large seafood company, was really prompted by a lot of people. There needs to be an education platform for this. And if not you, who else will it be?
Okay.
That's how the Oyster Master Guild was born. There are, I believe, 60 or 70 level twos now, which is the level we have so far, 1 and 2. And this involves a lot of education, understanding aquaculture, the building blocks of this industry. And then level 2 is more hospitality, dining experience, pairings, profiling, all sorts of things around oysters. The next level, I believe, will be more presentation in front of the board, more storytelling, more taste work. It's an incredible program, and it's building a lot of new businesses like mine, which can now use that certification as a way to not only justify the work that we do, but teach people that modern taste appreciation and use those tools to kind of get people excited about this new space that we're in.
Yeah.
We're really confident we don't want to move into a world where we get too exclusive, right? And sometimes the wine industry can feel that way. That's what I love about oysters. There's no vintage that we can bottle. There's no way that we can say this oyster always tastes like this thing. So it's more about staying in the present and just tasting what we're enjoying right now.
Your book is it's such an intimate and personal journey, finding your passion, confronting your fears, and setting yourself free, right, from a work world that was really not fulfilling you. What has the process of writing the book, reliving your personal and professional journey, what has that given you?
Hmm. Well, it wasn't an easy process. I think I was very ambitious for book number one, if I'm honest. And it started really as just being so inspired by a few people that I started finding myself holding back, reserving a few stories. And I don't know why. I just didn't want to release them on the blog. I felt like they were almost too special, a part of my personal journey. So I was holding on to them for a while. And then I was like, you know what? I'm going to try and write a book. It was going to be purely nonfiction and not have any of my journey in it. So this book evolved because I was getting a lot of feedback going, from agents and publishers asking me, well, there's none of you here in this book. Why did you decide to do this? That is the question I'm trying to answer. And so I went back. I just went back from square one, went to a bunch of workshops, took some memoir workshops as well that could help kind of hone that narrative piece. Spent, 5-6 years writing this book and trying to get it as perfect as I possibly could. And then going back to every person in this book and making sure they were really happy with how I portrayed them too.
Right. And then, of course, there's finding a publisher. What was that journey like?
About a year of pitching, I'm not going to lie. And then I took a break because Lady Oyster started the business. And I just thought, you know what? I'm going to hold off. Just maybe it's not the right time.
Yeah, but then soon enough, you found a home with Island Port Press. So you're in the thick of it.
All colliding at one time. New business, book coming out. It's a big summer.
Yeah, it is a big summer. It's a very exciting time. So if you could ask our listeners to think about or do one thing differently, either in how they look at the sea or eat oysters or seafood, or think about the working men and women on the waterfront, what might that be?
What I would say to a consumer who loves oysters and who eats oysters is I want them to start looking at themselves differently. Because this is such a regenerative food source and because we are giving back so much to the environment, the more oysters we eat, the more farmers can put in the water. So we're creating even better ecosystems as we eat these oysters. So I would say to start shifting your mentality when you consume something to, am I contributing versus just consuming? And I think that feeling of contribution to the environment is going to be so heartfelt and wonderful as a mental position. Aside from that, take it slow.
Yeah.
Enjoy the oyster. Don't eat them so fast.
Right. Yeah, and don't smother them in heavy duty cocktail sauce, I guess, unless it's really good cocktail sauce. Okay. So, last question. As you know, this podcast is called Tales of the Sea. Do you have a favorite tale of the sea? A book or a story or a song or a remembrance, something that you come back to time and again that puts you in that, well, I'll call it a happy place.
Every time I think about Tales of the Sea, I think about my grandfather, him as a commercial fisherman, and the wonderful anecdotes and things he's told me over the years about his life. If I could write a whole book about him, I would. From crabbing in the Chesapeake to fishing down in the Gulf of Mexico. There was just really one special weekend where just he, my grandmother, and I got to spend some time in Apalachicola, which was the epicenter of the pre-shucked oyster market. And we just sat on rocking chairs, staring at the Gulf. And he told me stories of what an abundance that used to look like in the Gulf. And I'll never forget it. I'll never forget those moments. And him laughing as we went to, the oyster bar down the street where he loved to get scolded by the waitress. Maybe not a specific tale, but one that just always involves him.
Oh, that's a lovely memory. Thank you for sharing that. Virginia, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. And I know the folks out there listening have had as good a time as I have, but the best is yet to come because they get to read the book soon. And it is really special. So, Virginia, I want to thank you again for joining me.
Thank you so much, Mark. This has been such a pleasure, and I appreciate everything that you do to keep these stories alive.
The book is titled Oyster Society Adventures with the Shellfishly Motivated by my guest today, Virginia Shaffer. It's available now at your favorite online or brick and mortar bookseller. And it's a terrific read. I encourage you all to pick up a copy. I promise you will not be disappointed. That ends this episode of Tales of the Sea. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell a friend or two. And a very special thanks to my guest today, Virginia Shaffer. This episode was produced at Munjoy Studios in Portland, Maine. As always, special thanks to my producer, Jewel Selbo. And remember, you'll find this podcast, Tales of the Sea, wherever you stream your favorite podcasts. I'm Mark Winkworth. Thanks for listening.